Okay, today is September 21st, 2011. My name is Mary Larson, and we are here at the OSU Library today with Dr. Harold Ivie, who is from the class of 1952 at the Veterinary Medical School. Dr. Ivie, thank you so much for being here today. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Can we start out by talking about your upbringing? Can you tell me a little bit about where you were born and raised?
I was born in Sand Springs, Oklahoma. I was raised between Sand Springs and Tulsa. Our mailing address was Tulsa, so I suppose that's my home address. I attended public school at Twin City Schools at what was called Bruner Station on the Sand Springs line, and attended grammar school and junior high at the Twin City Schools. And then I attended, high school, beg your pardon, high school at Sand Springs High School. Graduated in 1944 and went into the Navy and spent a couple of years in the service and spent some time in the Philippines. Returned to San Francisco. I should digress a second and say that I went through basic training in San Diego, Naval Training Station, and then shipped out of Treasure Island in San Francisco to the Southwest Pacific, and then returned back to San Francisco where the ship was decommissioned, and returned home, and went back to California for a brief period and worked at Panay Airlines at San Francisco International Airport for about 6 months or so, and then returned back to Tulsa and came down to Stillwater and enrolled at Oklahoma A&M College as a pre-veterinary student, and after a couple of years entered veterinary school, School of Veterinary Medicine, in September of 48.
Okay. Well, before we go any much further with that, if we can go back to
of course.
Your younger years.
Okay.
You were talking about the Sand Springs High School. How big was that then?
I think our graduating class was perhaps 150 or thereabouts.
Okay.
Maybe a few more.
Was there a teacher that you had in high school that had a particular influence on you, a teacher or a coach? Or
Probably. There were two people, I think. One was a math teacher, and I'm trying to come up with her name.
We can always add it in later.
Okay, Miss Payton, Payton. She was an influence, and I think probably our bandmaster, not that I was that fond of music or anything, but he taught us about character, honesty, dependability, work ethic, that sort of thing, and that's what I gained from him more, I think, than anything else. But that I think had an influence on me, mm-hmm. as well as the influence of my parents. They were sticklers for all of those things as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did your parents do when you were growing up?
My father worked for a Sinclair oil refinery, and my mother was a part-time school teacher and a homemaker. And as I got a little older, we grew into a family dairy that got rather large, and the cows produced the milk, and we took care of that milk. We strained it, filtered it, chilled it, bottled it, and delivered it door to door and to mom and pop grocery stores. And this went on for about 4 years, I guess. And our morning started at about 4 a.m. and I had a milk route on my way to school. And we had a couple of pickup trucks, and I would have a truckload of milk and just delivered it on my way to school. And when school was over, I had a truck full of empty, dirty bottles that I had to get home and get those bottles washed and cleaned and ready for the evening milking. And that took us into the straining, filtering, chilling the milk, and bottling it for the evening and the next morning's delivery. Also had a milk route in the early evening, short, but bed was about 9 o'clock, and then 4 o'clock rolled around very early in the morning. It was a lot of hard work, and I did my studies as I could during the day. The rest of my day was busy looking after the dairy.
Mm-hmm. Now, would that have been while you were in high school? Or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what years, maybe 39?
Oh, I would say 40 probably.
Okay.
We had always had livestock,
Mm-hmm.
and but it grew and grew and grew until we had about 25, 30 cows that we milked. And yeah, that was through the war years.
Mm-hmm. Now, it sounds like you wouldn't have had time for too many school activities with a schedule like that.
I was in the high school band,
Mm-hmm.
and that was about it.
Mm-hmm. What did you play?
Clarinet.
Clarinet?
Not well, but a clarinet.
Okay. Now, you would have been growing up and going to school during the Dust Bowl and the Depression.
Yes.
When you were young, were those two separate things in your mind, or were they pretty closely tied together?
Well, they were close. The Depression really hit agriculture in the 20s. My parents, my older brother was born in Missouri, and my parents started out to farm. They rented a farm. They borrowed the money to buy the implements and the livestock, the horses, to produce the farming, and they borrowed the money from the bank to start farming. And in 1921, I think wheat was about $2.50 a bushel, something like that. In 1922, wheat was selling for 25 cents a bushel. So my parents were strapped for cash, and they sold all of these material at a public sale, I'm told, and they've got about 50 cents on the dollar, what they had bought it for the year and a half previous. That was the Depression for them, and my mother had a teaching credential, so she obtained a job in Oklahoma to teach, and so my parents moved from the farm in Missouri to Oklahoma, where my mother taught, and my dad got a part-time jobs as he could. And my brother was an infant and growing up at this time. I came along a few years later in 1927, and I'm sure I added financial burdens to my parents, but I don't recall that there was ever any loose change laying around our house during the 30s. It was very, very tight financially.
Mm-hmm.
We produced most of our own food. We had about an acre of land, and we produced, we had a milk cow, we had chickens, we raised pigs, and these were all food animals that we used. And we had a large garden that we ate from, and my mother would can vegetables and get us through the winter. That's how we survived the Depression. My dad finally got a full-time job at Sinclair Oil Refinery. I think this probably happened about 1934, something like that. And it didn't earn a lot of money, but it did put a roof over our head and food on the table. The Dust Bowl didn't affect eastern Oklahoma as it did the western and panhandle of Oklahoma, which virtually blew away all the topsoil. But there were a few days where the dust blew all the way into the east. I think they said at one time it hit New York, and they literally blotted out the sun in New York. And we had days when the sun would be blotted out from the dust, and there was dust in the house. There was no way to keep it. It was like talcum powder, and it was miserable and hot and dry. We had about 5 years of drought. And at the same time, there was a depression, a severe depression. And the depression didn't end until the war effort began, and pretty much full employment 1939 and 40. Of course, after 1941, why we were in a full-scale war with Germany and Japan. Those were dark days.
Now, you mentioned that the dust would get into the house. Do you remember your mother trying to do anything to keep it out?
Oh yes, we would take towels and mostly towels and moisten them and put them under the doors and in the windows to keep the dust out. But it was so fine. People that were out working in it would usually wear some kind of cloth over their face and nose and mouth, and try and keep from breathing that in. It was grim.
Did it affect the livestock for the dairy? Well, it would have been before you got too many for the dairy.
Our dairy started after the Dust Bowl. I'm trying to remember. I think it was about 1935 when the western Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle finally got rain and the drought ended, and the erosion stopped. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the western Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, but carcasses and absolutely no vegetation, and would take the paint right off your house.
But it didn't impact your livestock that much. I mean, if you had just a couple around at the time.
Right. No, we didn't have the dairy during the Dust Bowl. That came a little bit later. But we were influenced by the Dust Bowl. And there were very dry, hot years and summers during that time, even in eastern Oklahoma. And but one did the best one could with what one had.
Yeah. Do you remember any farm auctions or anything at the time, or was that more limited? I mean, I'm thinking between the Dust Bowl and the Depression.
No, I don't think I was old enough to know what was going on or realize what was going on in the larger farming communities.
Did you know any families who moved away during that time?
No, I don't. I don't recall. In our neighborhood where I lived, families came and went, but here again, I was so young, I didn't know where they were going. There was a lot of migration to the West Coast from Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, Kansas, throughout the Southwest. Depression, Dust Bowl, whatever, and for what they thought about the employment on the West Coast, the opportunity for employment, I'm not sure that it materialized as much as some of the immigrants had hoped for. But yes, there was a large migration from the Southwest to California, Oregon, Washington.
Now, were there any particular, vignettes or stories, things that you remember as a small child, either from the Dust Bowl or Depression, that made a particular impact on you?
Well, we had, between Sand Springs and Tulsa, we had a communities of what we term squatters.
Mhm.
And they lived on public lands. Their resident was made out of shipping cartons. Their cooking, the way they heated and cooked was with an oil drum that had the top cut out and sand in it, and they would put wood in and had a stovepipe, and they would cook on that and heat this resident. No running water, no electricity. One time there was a family that their son was a year older than I am. This is a story that goes back to, let me think, I would say probably 1935, 34, 35. They lived in the field of a farm. The farmer allowed them to have their residence, which was again built of shipping crates and that sort of thing, scrap lumber, whatever they could square up to. And and where I attended public school, we didn't have a kitchen or a lunch. We had one room that was set aside for lunches. Now, you either brought your lunch and ate it at school, or you went home for lunch, or you did without. There was no other alternative. There was a young man who's lived in this squatter situation in this field, no electricity, no running water. And he came to lunch and he would have 2 pieces of homemade bread with the filling between the 2 bread would be pork lard. Well, the kids at the lunchroom, I was fortunate enough, I lived close enough that I would go home for school, for lunch. And this young man would, and the kids used to swap sandwiches. I'll give you a ham and cheese for an apple or an orange or a bologna sandwich. No one would ever trade sandwiches with this young man, knowing that was lard between those 2 pieces of bread. It was customary that boys would attend school in the late spring or early fall barefoot in the primary grades. The young ladies never did that, but the boys did. Well, this young man one day came to school, and it was frost, and the ground was somewhat frozen, and he came to school barefoot. And the teacher, principal, knew my mother because she taught at this school at times, and she said, "This young man is there, and he has no shoes. Can you fit some of Harold's shoes on him and give him a bath and some fresh clothes? And my clothes would fit him." My mother said, "Of course." And he walked from school to our house, which was a short distance. And my mother put him in the tub and gave him a good scrubbing and put shoes on him and socks and fresh clothes and fed him a good hot meal. And he was not the least bit embarrassed about a strange woman undressing him and giving him a good scrubbing in our bathtub, and was thrilled to get a hot meal and have shoes on his feet to wear when it was so cold. That was a sad story. And this family moved away, and I have no idea where they went or what happened to them. We live near the Arkansas River, and once or twice a year, the Arkansas River would always flood. And the squatters along the Arkansas River on this public land, they would have their shelters, we call it houses, these squatters. And when the river would get out of its banks, as it did frequently in the spring, their houses would wash away, and they would leave. Never knew where they went, but when the river would recede and the soil would dry out, they would come back and rebuild get the scrap lumber and the shipping crates and whatever they could scrape up and build their houses again. Again, no electricity, no running water. I don't know how they survive, but they seem to. That's pretty much the things that I can remember about the Depression, the Dust Bowl, pre-World War II.
Mm-hmm.
It was a tough life for a lot of people.
I was going to say rough times.
Especially if we were unemployed, uneducated. It was tough, very difficult.
Now, when you left high school, World War
Two's
II
full
would
blown.
have started while you were in high school.
Yes, right.
So
So
what did you do when you
Well,
graduated?
you're going to be drafted, I didn't want to go into the Army. So I said, I'm going to join the Navy, which I did, and I got a free trip to California, but the government's expense. Went through basic training, and the next thing I know, I was at Treasure Island and headed west. I knew not where I go, but we got there in about three and a half weeks, and the islands of Philippines.
Now, where did you do your basic training?
San Diego.
San Diego.
San Diego Naval Station.
When you were there doing basic training, did you have any additional training after that? Was there a specialty you wanted?
No.
You know, within.
No.
Okay.
The next thing I knew, we were on a troop train. We ended up at a place called Camp Shoemaker, which was near Stockton, California. It was a temporary military installation. It's not there any longer. I'm sure it dissolved right after World War II. One of the things that I noticed about it, there were German POWs there, along with the Navy. And they would go on work parties in the morning, and you'd see them. They'd have on their shoulder a shovel or a hoe or a rake, and they're singing and happy as they can be. Okay, and I'm sure they were damn glad to be out of Europe and being shot at and freezing. They were well fed, well housed, and being treated very well. And they were happy campers. The reverse of that was in Pearl Harbor. We were there at a time, and there were Japanese POWs there. Not a lot, but if some. And if there was anyone that appeared angry or dejected or unhappy, it was at the Japanese POWs there. And I have learned since that it was considered an insult to family, and really, if you were taken prisoner or you surrendered, if you surrendered, that was terrible in the Japanese culture. Hence, they thought that during the campaign in the Pacific, you take no quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Bad.
Yeah. Now, when you ended up shipping out to the Philippines, you said you were on a troop ship?
Yeah.
And
I think there are about 7,000 of us on that thing.
what unit were you assigned to when you were leaving?
Well, the first place I got off that boat was on the island of Samar. I hear it now pronounced Samar. I was there for a short period of time, and the next thing I was assigned to what was called a landing craft infantry, an LCI. Very small vessel, smallest seagoing vessel the Navy had. They didn't call it a boat or a ship, it was a vessel, a craft. Flat bottom, run the bow up on the beach, discharge the troops.
Mhm. Just like you always see with the pictures at Normandy.
Not the little Higgins boats, but this thing is about 120 feet long, about 20 feet wide. We could
Okay.
carry about a platoon of military. It was an experience.
Mhm. Where did you want to talk about where else you were, or what
I
action
spent
you saw?
most of the time between Samar, Leyte, and another island called Panay. The capital city of Panay was Iloilo. It was the nearest thing to civilizations that I had seen. Navy had a submarine base there that the Japanese captured, and that was the first place I ever saw permanent buildings in those islands. Everything else was thatch roofed and set up on stilts, but all of these buildings, first of all, the Japanese took it, and then they gave it up. MacArthur and the Army moved up from Leyte, went north towards Manila. And these buildings were stucco type buildings. And they didn't have a roof, and they have holes that you could drive a truck through. But that was the nearest thing I saw to civilization, and it had been retaken and was settled and peaceful when I was there. But those were the three places I spent most of my time.
And how long were you in that general area?
I was in the military about 2 years.
Okay, so you were there the whole time for the most part, or?
Well, yeah, I think I was in stateside maybe 2 or 3 months, and then came back and spent another time. We decommissioned the ship, and I guess I was another couple of months.
Okay.
In San Francisco.
Okay. How much communication did you manage to have with home while you were gone?
Well, my mother said she baked cookies and sent them. I don't know who ate them. I ever got a cookie, but she said she would routinely bake something and ship it. I never got a piece of mail done. We were never in any place long enough to get mail. None of us on board ever got a letter.
Mm-hmm.
No one. None of the crew, that is.
Were you on one ship
Mm-hmm.
most of the time?
Yeah, all the time.
And what was the name of?
LCI, and it had a number, but I can't remember.
Okay.
609, I think, but I can't be sure.
Okay. And when you first got to the Philippines, that would have been in 1944,
Yeah.
maybe the end of 1944?
End of 44.
What was going on generally around there at that
Well,
point?
Samar had been secured. Leyte was fairly secure. That was our home base with TAC Club in Leyte. That's where General MacArthur got his feet wet. Everybody's seen that picture. That was our home base. We traveled back and forth between Samar and Leyte a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We hauled troops around and from one place to another. Mostly that's what we did. We did take one USO group. I can't remember where we took them. It's the first time I'd seen a white face other than the crew. There were some really pretty girls on there. We all oogled.
So you folks were involved in the transportation end of things,
Right.
moving,
That's what we
moving
did.
supplies and people. And
Well, yeah, people mostly.
People mostly.
Yeah.
so what would an average day have been like? Or was there an average day?
Well, I was a cook,
Mhm.
and we fed, like, our crew would be maybe 25. If we had a couple extra gunner's mates, got maybe 30. So we'd serve 90 meals a day on a very small galley. And my whole thing was, getting ready. We'd serve 2 meals, breakfast and lunch, and then be off. And the other cook would come on and put the evening meal on, and then do the breakfast and lunch, and then then I would come back on and do the evening meal and breakfast and lunch. So we'd alternate, and they were long hours, but it was kind of an every other day deal, and it got monotonous, but we ate quite well, really.
Did you get to use any of the local foods?
No, ma'am.
Not much left at that point.
I have to tell you about, we're on this island of Panay, and this capital city, Iloilo, and it had been secured, and the locals were starting to assimilate them, get their lives back in order.
Mhm.
And they had a marketplace. Now, the marketplace was in town, and it was a wooden rack that went from the back high and the back down, slanted towards the front. It was out in the sun, and the only thing on that rack was fish. Now, these hadn't been cleaned, just fish. And they're sitting in that sun, and it was a hot sun. We were just off the equator a little ways. And you could smell the market from some distance.
Probably didn't want to be downwind of it.
And I'm thinking, this is what the locals are, and these ladies would come back and they'd pick up a fish and they'd look at it, and put it back, and pick up another fish and look at it and put it back. I thought, good God. None of us ever ate off the ship. We always ate on board. And we knew what we're getting on board. And but the local gentry ate a lot of rice, and I think there's some pork available, poultry. They would raise a pig or two under the house, and with chickens under their house, and fish, a lot of fish. And the Japanese took most of their food. I mean, the atrocities were unbelievable, just unbelievable. It's really grim.
Mm-hmm.
But no, we didn't take any of the local food. We did get food from Australia and New Zealand, and we got eggs and potatoes. Potatoes were fresh. There was never any milk or any dairy products or anything like that. The eggs from New Zealand were iffy about, they weren't well refrigerated, and they, out of 30 dozen, you might get half of them that were edible. The other half you'd throw out.
You'd crack them and check them before you threw them in something.
The only way the crew would eat eggs was sunny side up. They didn't trust that we got all of the rotten eggs out of they wouldn't take a scrambled egg. But
well, towards once the war ended,
mm-hmm.
You were still in the Navy at
Mm-hmm.
that point.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? I mean, where were you when that happened?
We were supposed to. They were going to put a landing on the main island of Japan, and no one knew anything about the atomic bomb, and especially at my level, no one knew about it. And because they were going to have a landing, the Pentagon had ordered 1 million body bags. And when the opportunity presented itself, Harry Truman said, drop the bomb, because the Japanese had been warned about this and tried to say, okay, make an unconditional surrender and we'll spare you. And Japan had been bombed unmercifully, mostly from Guam. And but at Japanese, no unconditional. So these are the terms we want. Well, no, we're not making any terms. And so the first atomic bomb was dropped, and I didn't know anything about that. We didn't get any news. And then I think it was 3 or 4 days later, the second one was dropped. And then it was a few days later when they surrendered unconditionally. They didn't want any more of that. And when that was announced, boy, we just had a wonderful time. We had an extra Coca-Cola. That was a treat. I think, well, depending upon how long you'd been in the service and the older people, most of the draftees were, and as I signed up, I wasn't drafted, I volunteered, but I volunteered in the Naval Reserve, and it was for the duration in 6 months. That was it. So the folks that have been out there doing the heavy lifting, they went home first, and boy, they were scampering home. I mean, they were just flocking home. And I would love to have been one of them, but it wasn't. And we had some fellows on board that did, and we had to bring that pile of junk home. It was built for 2 invasions. It did 4. And it was worn out, literally worn out. So we made it to Guam, and then we got some service repairs. And then we made it to Pearl Harbor. We stopped at, I think it was Anahuac or Johnson Island, and got some more repairs. We had problems with our generators, and then we stopped at Pearl Harbor, and we went into repairs there for, gosh, we were in dry dock for, I can't remember how long. It seemed like forever, because I wanted to be home. And we eventually made it back to the States.
That was a long trip home.
Like forever. So, and they put that thing in mothballs, I think. I'm not sure, and it wasn't even decent for salvage. And somebody in Washington, D.C., in all their infinite wisdom, decided to, well, at any rate, got off the damn thing and got discharged. And some of the Navy officers tried to talk us into signing up for another couple of years, and I want to go home. I've had enough. I was not fond of the military, and I don't know, I'd like to be independent. I think I would suggest that I'm like that. And the thing about it, there was nothing really you could call your own. You were told when to get up, what to wear, how to wear it, what you're going to do for the day. You didn't have to think at all. Just everything you were told, everything to do and how to do it. And you forgot how to think for yourself, really, literally. When I was discharged, all of a sudden, I'm on the streets and I got discharged in San Francisco. Well, all of a sudden, I realized, I don't have anybody to tell me what to do. And a kind of a shock, because so I hung around for a few days and finally got on a train to Tulsa. And but it was I had a big adjustment from going from a military life, a regimented life, to being on my own. When I got home, my jobs were extremely hard to come by. I'm not sure about the numbers, but I've heard 2 numbers. I'd heard that one number was there were 13 million men and women in uniform during WW, and I heard another number, it was 16 million. I don't know which is correct. But suddenly there's a flood of labor available in the United States. And when I arrived in Tulsa, there were no jobs, absolutely no jobs.
And the guys that had gotten out
Early,
6 months
if
earlier.
there were any jobs available,
Mm-hmm.
they were taken. So we had what was called, the government offered what they called $20 a week for 52 weeks unemployment. And so it was called the 5220 Club. And I joined the 5220 Club, and I was living at home and sitting around, couldn't find a job. My mother is nagging at me to go back to school. And so my brother was in college, and well, he was graduated at this point, and from vet school at Texas A&M. And so you've got to get in school. And I just wasn't quite ready for it yet. So I went back to San Francisco. I knew I could get a job at the airport in San Francisco. So I got a job with Panay Airways. And I was a stock clerk. and I was making enough money to support myself, and living in a boarding house, and it was very, very good meals, and it was comfortable, and I was doing okay. My boss said to me one day, he said, Ivy, we have a maintenance base in Fiji. And he said it pays more money per hour and gives you a per diem for living expenses. It's a beautiful place. We need a stock clerk there. And I said, Red, there's something you don't understand. I just got back from there, and you don't have enough money, neither does Panay, to get me to go back. I ain't going. So I thought, well, maybe Mother's right. So back I come, I'm in school. So that was that.
Well, how long were you back in San Francisco, do you think?
4 or 5 months, I guess, something like that.
And was the airport still south of the city like it is now?
Oh, right.
Same
right,
place?
Same place,
Okay.
yeah, right there. That's where I worked. Rode the bus and got to and from work, and everything was hunky-dunky until they went. I'd said, if I never see another palm tree, it'll be too soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what made you decide to go into veterinary medicine when you went
Well,
back?
I have been Oklahoma an agricultural state, primarily agriculture. Been around the dairy industry enough to know that I didn't want to be a dairyman. But I thought veterinary medicine would be pretty good, but I would like to do the small animal end of it. And so my brother was a veterinarian, and so I thought, well, yeah, let's give it a shot. And well, let's see. The vet school opened, the first class, I think, was only about 20 students in the first class. And they started like in December, and they went through into the summer to finish their first year, and then started their second year in the fall of 48. And I started my first year fall of 48.
But you'd come back and taken some pre-vet
Oh,
courses.
yeah, in
previously.
46 and 47,
Okay.
yeah.
So were you going back to school on the GI Bill at
Yep.
this point?
That was the thing that paid the way. I was well paid for what I did.
Mhm. Was it enough, was the support you got with the GI Bill, was that enough so that you didn't have to have an extra job, or?
Well, I didn't have enough GI Bill to see me through all the way through. That's you could only get 4 years.
Mhm.
I think I had 3 years eligibility, something like that. So, but I'm in school, 6 years, I guess. And so I had to make up. You could enter for a semester and you could drop out for a semester. Then you paid your fees and bought your books. The GI Bill paid a single student 65, first of all, paid all your fees, furnished all your books and supplies, and gave you $65 a month living expenses. And you could survive on that. If it was not a lot, but you could survive. If you were a married student, you got $90 a month, plus your school supplies and so forth. If you were a married student with one child, you got $115 a month, and so forth. If you were a married student and you had 6 kids, you got $115 a month. And that was the max, was 150, no matter how many children. One of my classmates had 5 kids when we graduated.
Wow.
I don't know how they made it, but they did.
Well, where were you living when you came to
Well,
A&M?
I lived in with some private homes, and then I got married in 1947, and lived Veterans Village in a house trailer initially, and then we got into what they called a hutman, And later we got into one thing that was like an apartment, which was the nicest thing they had to offer. And that was where I spent the rest of my time on campus.
Okay. Well, since you were in only the second class to enroll at the vet med school, what was it like being there at the time?
Well, I didn't know what was going on in the other schools that were established. We realized that it was pretty primitive, I guess is the word. For an example, our first courses in the vet school primarily was anatomy and histology or microbiology. And this was in a temporary wooden frame building between the life science building on the east and the barns on the west. I mean, it was out on the edge of nowhere. I think the South Veterans, there was North and South Veterans Village, and I think it was in between Life Science and the South Veterans Village, if I remember right. And it was pretty grim. And they couldn't accommodate more than 40 students, I don't think. And they were having a hard time with the microscopes for that many in the microbiology. They were building the vet school, what we now know. But by the time we graduated, they only had a fraction of it finished. We did I think the class ahead of us did a lot of their clinical work in the life science building in their lab. And then their senior year, we were our junior year and their senior year, moved into the clinics. If you've been in the vet school out there, you know where that auditorium is? And there's a long hallway. Well, that long hallway, and then on the west end of that, there was the L-shaped, was supposed to be the swine part. Well, that was the small animals. The stalls for the livestock was in that long hallway. And the classrooms were upstairs or in that auditorium area, mostly upstairs. And that was it. Mm-hmm. There weren't a lot of patients that came through the small animal clinic or the large animal clinic, a few, and they did the best they could with what they had. I think I learned a lot about veterinary medicine after I left school and went into an employee in a small animal practice. Mm-hmm. And but at any rate, I think we had the basics and the foundation to practice.
You know, do you remember where some of the faculty members had their offices? Because I'd heard that someone said they used to have office hours in one of the stalls.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they might consider them stalls.
Or what had been set up as...
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Mostly when you go out from that auditorium, you went out straight out that to west, and then you made a sharp right-angled turn going south. And there were... those were to become stalls, but they were used for offices at that time.
Okay. And were there any faculty members? I know there were faculty members.
Yeah,
I guess I was going to say, were there any faculty members who had a particular influence on you or who you worked closely with?
Well, there's some that you admire more than others. I'm not... Louis Moe is someone that comes to mind that I admired. Wiley Wolf was another. a Dr. Tennille, I can't think of his first name. He ended up in the doing the director of the radiology.
What was the social life like? Were you and your classmates a pretty close-knit group?
Well, out of the class, we graduated 36. 40 went in and 36 came out. Out of the 36, I think all but 3 were ex-GI. So our social thing was sit around, if we had a break between classes and we're going to have coffee or something, we'd sit around and tell sea stories, lie to one another about what all we did during the World War II. There were 1 or 2 social events a year where husbands and wives and kids were involved and invited. That was about it. As classmates, we're kind of broken up into study groups. There'd be 3 or 4 in a study group. Mm-hmm. And so they would, we would always sit around and study and have coffee until time to go to bed and get up the next morning and start all over again. I don't think there was much social. If there was a sporting event, for example, and I don't know if it's still true, but the field house would only hold, like, let's say 10,000. I don't remember how many, but no, I don't think it would hold that many, no. At any rate, half of the students, if you had a ticket, if your season ticket for basketball was, if you were number 1, well, you get the odd home games, tickets for odd home game. If you were 2, you got the even home games, and so half the student body could attend one because there wasn't enough seating to accommodate the entire student body. Football was a little bit different, and we would always try to hit the football games and the basketball games that we were entitled to. That was a social thing that we did. Hank Ivie was king in basketball, and we didn't do very well in football the entire time that I was here. I don't think the football team did anything spectacular. I may be mistaken. I think the wrestling team did well. I had no interest in wrestling or tennis or golf or anything else that was athletic, but basketball and football. Hank Ivie was, as I say, he and a fellow by the name of Fogg Allen that coached KU. They were always at one another. I believe that this has nothing to do with veterinary medicine.
Well, it does, in that it's part of your social life here on campus.
Iba had the first 7-foot basketball player in basketball history, collegiate player. And I can't remember his name. I believe he's recently passed away. But one of the seasons that he was at A&M, Iba had him stand down under the goal, and when they would shoot the goal, they just pushed the ball out. Well, they didn't score much. And so the next year, that was illegal, called goaltending, and it made a big difference. He also, and that made Fogg Allen very mad, I think. And the next thing that they did was that he was ball control. And they would hold the ball and hold the ball and hold the ball. And as long as they held on the ball, the other team couldn't score. And it was Hank Ivie's reason that we now have 25-second ruling to shoot the basket. There's a time frame on it. And the opposing coaches always complained that it's so boring because you don't take that many shots. But they might win a game 31 to 26 or 35 to 30. It was low scoring. I mean, there's none of this 70, 80, 90, 100 point games with Hank Ivie around. So he changed the rules of basketball, had a big impact on it. I think one of our big opponents was KU. And I think we were in the Missouri Valley Conference. I think that's what it was called in those days, but I'm not sure. There was also a Southwest Conference. At any rate, that was an interesting phenomenon that occurred while I was a student here in basketball. What else happened?
Well, were you involved in homecoming at all with the
We used to build a float for the homecoming parade the veterinary school had had, and we had, I think the first parade we were in was, would have been the homecoming would be in the fall in 1948. We had a float. We won some sort of a prize. We had a tragic thing occur then that they were finishing the float the night before the homecoming, and they had painted it, and they decided to paint. They decided to clean the spray gun with a paint thinner, and they did, and they sprayed this material. And we were doing this in a barn, and I wasn't there at the time, but at any rate, what they didn't realize that this mist that came out was very, very flammable. And when they turned the compressor off, there was a spark, and it ignited this thing. And two of the fellows got burned very badly. One of them was wearing a white leather belt, Western style, burned it in two in the back. I mean, they were in the hospital for days and days and weeks getting over the burns. It was really good. They both recovered. The classmates took all of the textbooks and the lectures, notes and everything to the hospital, and they could read these things and they would tutor them. And both of them graduated with their class, and but that was a tragic thing. That was our first float, and at any rate, we had a float. Of course, that class graduated. Let's say I was 48, so they were sophomores. We were freshmen. And then we had a float the following year. I think we had a float every year for 4 years, that I recall. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like we did. I'm not sure what we did. That, I think, was a dinosaur or something that waggled and moved its head and so forth. But at any rate, that was a homecoming thing that occurred.
Mm-hmm. And what, just generally speaking, what do you remember campus being like when you were here? Or Stillwater, for that matter?
Well, let me explain it this way. I initiated our 20th reunion. And so probably at least 20 or 25 of us showed up for the, I think we came back at homecoming, but I'm pretty sure it was homecoming. And my family and I, my wife and son and I, we flew out, and I guess we rented a car. I think we did. And but I was riding around the campus with three other veterinarians. This veterinarian was the other three besides myself. The other three were Oklahoma residents and practices, and some of them were close by. And one of them had his car here. or riding around the campus, and to explain what was my feeling about Stillwater and my time here. One of them said, "Wasn't it great here?" And I said, "I left here, I was naked and hungry." And I said, "I don't remember anything great about it." It was academically demanding, studied all the time, worked a little part-time, and did with a lot most of the time. And that's the way it was.
Now, once you graduated,
Mm-hmm.
well, actually, before we get to graduation, as part of your training, I think you mentioned that you were involved in working on the McAllister outbreak.
There was an anthrax outbreak in McAllister, and they sent 2 carloads of seniors down there. I think there were 8 of us, maybe. I don't think there were 10, I would say more like 8. Went down with a faculty member, and there was a herd of, I think they were Herefords, but I don't hold me to that. And they had the ability to work these through stanchions and squeeze chutes and corrals. And we were able to temp the cattle. And we had what we called a grade 4 spore vaccine, I believe. And it was an attenuated vaccine. Would not produce anthrax. And if the animal was not running a temperature, it would get a spore vaccine. I believe it was given intradermally. Boy, this goes back a ways. If they were running a fever, we'd get out the penicillin and give them a load of penicillin. I don't believe we gave them any vaccine because we thought they were already incubating the organism. And then there were some that were dying in the terminal stages of anthrax, and they were destroyed. And I'm trying to remember how they were disposed of. It seems to me like it was a lime deal.
Like a lime pit?
Yeah,
Or-
a lime pit. And they didn't want to just put them in or burn them because those spores would float and they'll live in the soil forever. Oklahoma's full of anthrax spores, and I'm sure they're still having outbreaks in it. And they used to drag the carcass over, throw it in the creek, the local creek, or draw where, and they're supposed to decompose. Everything decomposed but the spores. And I'm no expert on anthrax, let me tell you. I don't know that much about large animal medicine anymore. But we were there for about a week, I guess, something like that. We worked through the herd.
Was it contained to one farm?
Yes, but they quarantined the farms around it for a time. And that farm, of course, was quarantined. And the state veterinarian took over after we left, and I don't know how we didn't hear any more about it. We were back to school and hitting the books and getting ready to graduate, and where are you going to work, and what are you going to do when you graduate, and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What time of year would this have been, fall or summer?
I think this was maybe in the spring, I think.
Okay.
But don't hold me to that either. It wasn't cold,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't brutally hot, so I would think spring.
Okay. Now, you mentioned temping the cattle. Once you decided, the ones with the high temperatures got penicillin, the other ones got the vaccine unless they were in terminal stages with anthrax. Did you separate, were they separated at that point? Or, I mean, except for the terminal, do you remember if the ones with the...
I think they probably were, and I don't really remember.
Mhm.
But I suspect that they were, because this was a fairly sophisticated ranch,
Mhm.
and I think they had the ability to do that.
Okay.
Boy, I don't remember for sure if they separated them, and I would hope they did. I hope we did.
Did they have you folks taking any precautions with masks or anything like that?
Seems to me like we were wearing gloves.
Okay.
I think that was about it.
Mhm. Were there any human infections that you know of?
No.
Any, even just
I didn't know of
cutaneous?
anyone, no.
Okay.
And none of us became infected.
Mhm. Do you have any recollection of how large that herd was?
No.
If it was, okay.
I have
Just
no
didn't
idea.
remember. Okay. And back at that time, were there any recommendations for treating areas that might have been potentially infected by spores, like some of the places where they dumped bodies previously? There might have been a buried carcass or a water hole that they thought may have been a problematic area. Were there any treatments for any of that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Okay. Did you have any other field trips like that during your time at?
We were
A&M?
sent to Duncan for another one, and it
Mhm.
turned out to be a false alarm.
Okay. Was that the same year?
A few weeks, maybe a month or 6 weeks later.
Okay.
I think we're getting ready to graduate too about that time. Seems to me like we were. I'd have to go back and look. That's been soon be 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I ran across a mention of the Duncan outbreak when I was researching for the 1957 outbreak.
Okay.
So I'll have the info on that. Are there any special memories, good or bad, from your time at the veterinary school that we haven't covered yet? Anything that sticks in your mind particularly?
I don't recall. I'll tell you just a sidelight that was kind of humorous. This has nothing to do with veterinary medicine, but it occurred. A number of the faculty members belonged to the military reserves, working towards a retirement plan. And obviously they were all officers. And one of our classmates was a lieutenant colonel. And when he got out of the military, active military, and went into the reserves. And he was the ranking officer. And they met once a month or once every 2 weeks for a couple of hours, and they would get credit towards retirement, attending these meetings. And so this student would conduct that meeting. And one day in class, one of our clinicians, should I mention names? I don't think I should.
It's up to you.
Well,
if you don't think you should, maybe you don't.
It doesn't.
Okay.
Our instructor was Dr. Wolf, Wiley Wolf, and he was a captain in the reserves. And the student's name was Chris Burnett, and he was the lieutenant colonel in the reserves. And the question said, Colonel Burnett, if you were out in the field and you saw a cow that had these symptoms, da-da-da-da-da, what would your diagnosis and treatment be? And he said, well, Captain Wolf, if I was out. And that was not uncommon because some of the students were older than the faculty. I'm sure they were glad to get rid of us, I think. It was, we weren't kids. It was, sometimes I kind of felt sorry for the kids that were there just out of high school because everybody in our class was serious. They were serious students. And we worked really hard. And I'm sure students today are working very hard. Oops, excuse me, I scratched my nose. But we I think had a different personality being older. Fairly mature. Some of us not myself, but some of our classmates had some pretty bad experiences in the military. We used to, like I say, we'd sit around at coffee time and spin yarns about what happened to you or why didn't you duck, you know. But I think that I don't recall anything else that occurred. We just attended classes, listened to lectures, took the tests, did what was expected of us in the clinics, did the treatments that we were supposed to do. One time I got in trouble. We had a clinician who really, probably one of the best small animal clinicians that we had. His name was Dr. Butler. He's a Colorado graduate. I think Colorado was ranked number 3 in those days. And he had a group of, and I was in his, we used to work through a section 2 weeks at a time. We'd go in large animal surgery for 2 weeks. We'd go in large animal medicine for 2 weeks. We'd go in poultry diseases for 2 weeks. We'd go in small animals for 2 weeks. Well, I was on small animals, and Dr. Butler had 3 or 4 dogs that were obese, and he wanted to put them on a special diet, reducing diet, and it was a new business, Hills Packing prescription diets, and they had this thing called RD, reducing diet, and I was to open a can of RD and give a half of it to each one of these dogs every morning and every evening. So I would, in the morning, I would open the cans and give each dog a half a can of reducing diet, and then come back later and I would discard what was left and give them another fresh half a can of RD. And he asked me, how's it going? I said, it works really well, Dr. Butler. He said, oh, really? And I said, yes, sir. They won't eat a bite of it. Well, that didn't sit very well, to say the least. But that was the truth. They wouldn't eat that stuff. Well, they modified it and made it more palatable later, but in the early days, the prescription diets were not that palatable. And that an RT just looked like a library paste to me. And probably tasted like it. But that Dr. Butler didn't smile at me for that for a few days after that. He thought I was a smart aleck.
Well, the dogs probably appreciated your telling the truth.
I suppose.
Now, I know you were interested in small animal,
Right.
in the small animal side of things.
Right.
Were there particular people you worked with as you did these rotations, essentially, or?
Well, I'll tell you now. Every opportunity I have in the summer, I worked in a small animal practice.
Mm-hmm.
One was in Tulsa and one was in Palo Alto, California. Spent the summer in 2 of these clinics. I was in small animal surgery for the 2 weeks, and the veterinarian in doing spaying a cat. And there were a bunch of us kids looking on, kids. 30-year-old kids, and he said, now when you, and I'd been in a couple of hospitals that and assisted in enough surgeries that I thought I knew better, but at any rate, he said, you make an incision in the cat's abdomen the width of your hand. Well, now some of those guys and he said it doesn't matter because it heals from side to side. And if you ever blurted out something you didn't mean to, and I blurted out, yeah, it splits open end to end. And he grabbed me and threw me out of the class and didn't allow me back in for the rest of that period that I had. Whatever it was, I don't remember how long maybe a week. I just kind of wandered around the place. And, oh, he was very angry at me. And I didn't think he was all that brilliant either, so I didn't mention his name. I better not. I don't know if he's still alive or not. I think he was only about a year out of school when he came on the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know who taught him, but boy, it was not what I had observed in practice, and I thought there were some pretty sharp practitioners that I worked in hospitals where they were. And but that was an experience. Did I have a lot of respect? Not that much.
And did you ever see that particular practice again?
That
particular approach to...
Oh, no, nobody did that. No, I don't know where in the world he heard that. If an incision was an inch long for a kitty cat to do it, they used to have what they called a buttonhole incision. And some guys could do a hysterectomy on a female cat through a buttonhole size incision.
Mm-hmm.
And do it very successfully. And
I'm sure the cats appreciated that.
in California today, if you were to adopt a kitten from the Humane Society, we have San Mateo Humane Society, and they do adopt out. In California's law, if you adopt an animal from a shelter, it must be sterile. And so they spay that kitten, maybe it's 8 or 10 weeks old. And the incision is probably 1 or 2 sutures at the most. You can get by with just 1 suture.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the width of your hand, I'll tell you. But that was an experience that I had. If I had just kept my mouth shut. Some of these things that blurt out. I did another one once. I won't mention names. Our general call at night, and a cow had a prolapse uterus, and we got her out of the truck and started up towards the stalls, and she collapsed. And her uterus is as large as twice the size of this, bigger than this.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to get the uterus back. And the clinician there, we called him, and he came. I was on night call along with 3 other senior students. And we called a clinician, he came in, and so we're all working to try to reduce this thing. And he sent me, the clinician sent me to the pharmacy to get something. I don't remember what it was. And as I walked by the cow, her gums were that color.
Mm-hmm.
And I got back.
So just bright white. Yeah.
And I said, "Do you want me to go get a unit of blood?" He said, "Well, let's get this back and uterus back in, and then we can give her." And one other time, and the rancher was standing there and heard me. He said, "If we don't do something pretty quick, it won't matter." And she took her last breath about then. And so he left. We put the cadaver in the autopsy shack, and he said, "Ivy, I want to see you in my office." I thought, "Uh-oh, you're out of here, Ivy." If you have any comments to make it anymore, you'd be damn sure the owner and client is not in earshot of what you got to say. And I apologized. I said, it just came out. I don't know why. I said, I didn't mean to, the timing was terrible. And again, I should have kept my mouth shut, but that's the way I am, I guess. Maybe that's why you got me in here. I have diarrhea of the mouth.
No, you've got good stories. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you did after graduation?
Well, I went to, my in-laws at that time lived in Palo Alto, and my wife, my ex-wife and daughter and They had room for us at their home, and I stayed there. The state boards were offered. We graduated about, I think, the 17th of May, something like that. And 2 days later, I was in my car headed for California. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And I arrived in California, and I took the state boards in Los Angeles after the UC Davis students graduated, and I think they graduated like mid-June, and then the state boards were offered in Los Angeles. So off to Los Angeles I go. Well, as it turns out, there were 4 out of my class that ended up in California.
Out of 36?
Out of 36, 4 in California. 2 in Southern California and 2 in Northern California. The 2 in Southern California are both deceased. And the other classmate in Northern California are both still around. But went to Los Angeles, took the state boards, 3 days, writing as hard as you could write, the little blue books, filled up, I can't tell you how many, and went home. And these had to be read and graded. They weren't machine graded. So we didn't get the results for June, July, August, September, and in the meantime, I had a family to feed. So we found an apartment and moved in, and I had to do something. So I took a job. Now, you do not have to have a state license to be a meat inspector. I have federal accreditation from tests I'd taken here in Oklahoma, so I had that applied in those days, 48. So I got a job as a meat inspector in San Jose,
Mm-hmm.
and worked, and I guess I was here about 2 months, and my boss called me from Sacramento and said, "We're going to transfer you to Paso Robles." And I said, I guess he thought that was okay. I had no desire to live in Paso Robles, where it gets hotter and blazes in the summer. And so he screamed at me on the phone. He was calling from Sacramento. "Send in your badge, blah, blah, blah." Okay. So I was fired because I wouldn't transfer. And that was all right. That's better than moving to Paso Robles. So I'm now wandering the streets again, looking for a job. But I don't have a license yet. So I bumped into these 2 veterinarians from Washington State. They graduated from Washington State. They were classmates. They had a 2-doctor practice, and they were looking for maybe a 3rd veterinarian. And they said, "Well, I'm coming to work and come to work Monday morning." I said, "I don't have a license yet." "Oh, that's all right." I said, "I don't know if I passed the state boards or not." "Oh, I know you did." And come on, they didn't know me from second. Well, I needed a job, and I thought, well, if nobody catches me here, I guess I'll be all right. And so it would have been more his neck than as much. I'd never gotten a license in the state of California if I'd have been caught, probably. And he'd have lost his license as well. But he knew more about what was going on in the state than I did. So I went to work for him, and I probably worked without a license for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 4 weeks, something like that. And then finally I got notice, and you passed the board, and at that time that made 3 of us in California, and we all three passed the boards. And then the fourth one joined later, and of course he passed the boards. But I worked for a few weeks in California in practice, private practice, without a license. And it shouldn't have happened, really. I mean, it would have been better off if I'd have worked as an attendant. But he wanted me to see clients and treat animals. So I did, and it was wrong, but I guess it worked out okay. That was the first thing that I did wrong in California. There are lots of other things I'm sure I did wrong. But,
so you joined up with their practice at that point?
I joined that practice, and I wasn't aware of it. Being the new kid on the block, I got all the nasty jobs. And we used to take our own night calls, our own emergency calls, and weekend duty, and it was a very busy practice, high volume. Ultimately, well, what happened was these two classmates that were partners, I didn't realize it, but they weren't getting along. And they'd been in practice about 5 years when I joined the practice. And about a year or year and a half into my job working there, they parted company. And the brighter of the two veterinarians in this thing was, he said to his partner, he said, "We're going to dissolve the partnership, and here's the situation. You can buy the practice for this price, or I'll buy the practice for this price. And or we can sell it to a third party, but I can guarantee you we'll get more money if we buy it from one or the other." And so one of them came to me on a few days later and said, "If I buy the practice, will you stay?" And I said, "Well, I need a job." And a few days later, the other one came by and said, "If I buy the practice, will you stay?" And I said, "Well, I need a job." I never said anything more than that, or take sides. But the right guy got the practice, and the other one moved on, and we grew to a 6-doctor practice, and I later was offered a partnership and was delighted. And there were three of us that were partners, and then there were two. One of them became very ill with malignancy, and then there was one, and I was the last one standing, so I ended up with a whole ball of wax. And I never took on any partners. Partnerships are very difficult to maintain, especially if wives are involved. And when that happens, I mean, I don't know, but that's what happened to these two fellows. One had better furniture and more clothes than the other one, or whatever, but I mean, it was that kind of thing. And but I decided that, and most everybody agreed that partnerships were bound most always to break up, and it's like a divorce. It's not good. So I never ever I never wanted a partner, and did not have a partner. When I retired, I sold the practice to a lady, and she's doing very well and is living happily ever after.
Now, was this down around San Mateo? Or?
Well, it's in San Bruno,
Okay.
Is the town, and it's about, I would say, between 12 and 14 miles south of San Francisco on the peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
Had another hospital in South San Francisco that I bought later. It's a nightmare to try to keep up with all that. I had about 20 or 25 employees. So you have 20 or 25 headaches when you have that around, both professional and non-professional. you work through it. And some people you make happy, some you make angry. Some are great employees, and I was never able to determine the quality of an employee is going to be on an interview. I am not that clever. Now, some people claim to be that clever, but I'm not. Never was, never have been, ain't never gonna be.
It's a tough, I was going to say, that it's a tough thing to try to determine on over such a short period of time.
Everybody's on their best behavior. And if they give you a reference, you know it's gonna be a good reference because it's grandma or somebody.
Well, they wouldn't have given it to you if they didn't think it was going to be a
That's
good
right. If
reference.
you're going to buy a car, a used car, and the previous owner, you're only going to get a reference to somebody that's happy with that car dealership. You're not going to get an unhappy one. So same thing applies. That I got some good reviews about an employee, and it has become such a hazard to. If you give a poor reference, you can get yourself sued. And I called another practice about a lady I was about to hire as a technician, and they gave her a glowing report about her. There wasn't a word of truth in it from day one. And I interviewed her, and I thought, boy, she's just fine. Wasn't worth a hoot, and but at any rate, I thought, well, I'll never ask you for a reference again. And this was a corporate practice. I don't know if you're familiar with corporate practice. Okay,
Mhm.
It was a VCA. No, it was a Bancroft practice in San Carlos, and but I said, okay, that's one.
Now, so it sounds like, I mean, from the very time you started out there, you were essentially with the same practice, even though
Never
the
left it.
ownership changed.
Never left it.
That's
It
a
went
long
from
time in one
two
place.
partners to three partners. One partner's gone. Then I worked for this solo owner. Then he took on two partners, myself and another veterinarian that we had worked in the practice. That person passed away. Then there's two partners, and I owned half of the practice then, and then my original partner decided he wanted to retire, so I bought his half of the practice. So I now own the practice. He owns the real estate, and finally he offered to sell me the real estate, and I bought it.
Did it have the same name the whole time?
Well, it was originally White and Morris, then it became White, and then it became White Ivie, and it's still White Ivie. And I thought that the lady that bought it, I said, change the name, but she said, I want to keep the name. I said, well, okay, so it's still White Ivie.
Okay. Now, having lived in California myself, I know what a threat both wildfires and earthquakes
Mhm.
can be in that neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm.
What special challenges do things like that pose for veterinarians?
Well, I think that we had a pretty hard shake in 1957, and but the building didn't suffer any damage. A lot of glass was broken, and we swept up a lot of glass and threw out a lot of pharmaceuticals and so forth, mopped up. But the building didn't suffer any structural damage, so at least to the best of my mind, I bought that building later and remodeled it. But I live about 2 miles from the San Andreas Fault, and I'm trying to think the name of the fault. Hayward Fault is probably more active and more likely to be, if they're going to predict a major earthquake in Northern California, probably be on the Hayward Fault. Well, that's quite some distance away. My home sits on some pretty solid ground. Where people are at risk with earthquakes or on landfill. And we have a lot of communities on landfill along the bay and up in San Francisco around Fisherman's Wharf.
That whole marina district there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. In 68, was it? Yeah, 68, I think. Was it, or am I, no, let's see. 89, what was the Loma Prieta?
I think it was 89.
89,
Yeah.
where the bridge fell through and the East Bay freeway collapsed and killed 165. There was a 3-story building in the marina, and the 3rd floor was at ground level.
I've seen some pictures like that, and you just wonder.
It just
And you just
sunk.
wonder why people rebuilt there.
Yeah, they redid it. Foster City is all on landfill. It's a huge community. As a matter of fact, an Oklahoman built Foster City.
Really?
Jack Foster bought that, and it was raised in an orphanage here in Oklahoma. He and his brother, and they're both gone now, but Foster City is sitting out there, and it may liquefy. But I'm up on a kind of a granite rock well above the bay, but the fault runs right down what we call Interstate 280 out of San Francisco, and I'm only about 2 miles from it.
Now, what about the wildfires? Have you ever helped with any of the evacuation of animals or anything
No,
like that?
I've never been around where, and it's all concrete and asphalt.
Okay.
We don't have.
Don't have
We
those
had
issues.
the San Bruno explosion of the gas main.
That's right.
That was only about, I used to live within a couple of blocks of that, a long time ago. The pet hospital is probably a couple of miles away, so it
I
wasn't
forgot about
affected.
that, yeah.
Wasn't affected.
Okay.
But there were 8 people killed in that. There are 35 homes destroyed. PG&E is in big trouble. And
Now, just to sort of wrap up a few things,
okay,
I understand that a few years ago you set up an endowment
yes, I did.
at OSU for the veterinary school. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure,
and what
I don't
prompted
mind. Yeah, whatever.
it? Just wondering what
Well,
inspired
are
you.
any specific questions that you want me to answer, or just to talk about it?
Yeah, just
Just
what
run off at the
inspired
mouth
you
about
to
it?
what inspired you to do that?
Well, a young man, his grandfather's a friend of mine. He was a graduate, had his bachelor's degree from UC Davis, and he wanted a summer job, and his grandfather asked me, we're good friends, could he have a job? And I said, sure. And so he came to work for us. Good kid, bright, good worker. End of summer, he said, would you write a letter of recommendation for me to enter vet school? I said, sure. So he says, I want to go to Cornell. I said, you'll never get into Cornell because you're a California resident. You'll be out of state. California has a good school. They have, a veterinary school. It's a good one. And he got all puffed up and he said, I want to graduate from an Ivy League school. I said, well, you're not going to get into Cornell. But so he tried and he didn't. But he did get in Pennsylvania later and graduated. And but every summer, wannabes used to want to come to work. Some would volunteer, some that we had jobs for. And never once in 50 years did I ever hear a young person say, I want to graduate from OSU. Not one. And I thought there's something wrong here. They wanted to graduate from Davis, they wanted to graduate Washington State, they wanted to graduate Colorado, but never heard anybody say, I've heard so much about OSU that I would like to graduate from there. So I said, I don't think that's acceptable. And so OSU had offered my brother a job some years ago as a clinician, large animal clinician. He asked what it paid, and when they told him, he said, I can't afford to take the job. And I knew what was being offered when we were graduating. One of my classmates had a master's degree in bacteriology and virology, and they offered him the job, head of the bacteriology department in the vet school. And what they offered him, he refused the job as well. And it was not adequate. I can't imagine anybody wanting the job. So I thought, well, I think maybe they're not paying enough at Stillwater for faculty at the vet school. And I think if the money is right, we'll attract talent, top talent. And I said, well, how do you do that? Well, you have to have a continual flow of cash into the veterinary school and the small animal department. I can't do it all, so I'm hoping that some of the equine and food animal medicine people will step up to the plate and do their share. But if I could get enough cash flow into the vet school, they could offer salaries that will attract top notch. So I thought, well, how are we going to do this? And I thought, well, if we put $5 million in this fund and $5 million in that fund, and the foundation invests that money, and they can't take a penny out of the principal other than their fee, and that principal will grow. When it reaches $100 million, then they can't touch the principal, ever, but they can take the net income out of that and give it to the veterinary school for salary enhancements in the small animal department. And we'll do the same thing over here. We'll have $200 million, and that should give them about $10 or $12 million a year to do something about the salaries, in addition to what they are, have at hand now. And some of the Jeff Cathy, I don't know if you ever met him. Okay, Jeff used to come out to California visit with me every year, and I told him, I said, I don't know. He said, well, we're going to hire a veterinarian, and maybe he's really wants to come to work here. Stillwater's a nice place to live, raise a family. And then they go into the offices in the basement, and they can't see out. I said, no, I don't think I want to work here. Well, I'm not going to build any buildings, and there's no bricks or mortars in this. It's just salaries. So, at any rate, this hospital, the real estate, is now owned by the vet school. Yeah.
Okay.
The lady who's buying the practice from me she has an option to buy it for herself January 1, 2013. That's hopefully when the first endowments will become available. That money will go to the foundation, and they're going to start investing it. And where am I? I've got to get my train of thought here. At any rate, that's the first part of it. The second part is we're invested heavily into a startup electronics firm in Portland, Oregon. And if it does well, I and the foundation will also do well, and the veterinary school will do well. If we don't, I've pledged $10 million. I don't know that I can come up with it unless this thing, we've got an awful lot of money tied up in it. And if it fails, I'm going to be in big trouble. But if it does halfway decently, we'll do well. Mm-hmm. But that's how I got here. And it's a long ways. I'll try to do a fund for a student scholarship. And same principle. If we gave the veterinary school, if I had the $10 million cash now and gave it to them today, they'd spend it by the end of this year, and that would be the end of it. I mean, that's whatever they got out of it is all there's going to be. That doesn't solve the problems for continued salaries. It has to be I'm waving my hands here. You'll have to erase part of that. It has to be an ongoing a cash source, or it's not going to do the job. And I think if we've got an outstanding faculty, we'll get outstanding students, graduate these kids. And I want to see OSU #1 veterinary school in the nation. I don't know if it ever will be, but I'm trying my best.
Well, I know everybody appreciates it.
We'll see what happens. Yeah. But that's how I got here.
Okay.
I think we should all feel some payback is due. The government did a lot of things for me, and I'm well paid for what I did and for serving the government. But the state of Oklahoma pays a lot of money towards an education. They think the fees are awfully high, but that's only about 1/3 of what it costs to keep that kid here. And if everybody felt that, well, I can only give $50 or I can only give $10, whatever. If every alum could do a little bit, it would be an enormous amount of money. I don't understand. I have a classmate, and I know he could sit down and write you a check for $10 million. I don't think he's about to. I think he's trying to figure out a way to take it with him. Didn't mean to scratch my nose. You'll have to edit some of this stuff out,
That's
please. But and I don't know why he's not. And I mentioned it. It just, you know. So that's. I think that the equine people should step up to the plate. The food animal medicine folks ought to step up to the plate. Small animal folks. Most of the small animals take care of the exotics, the birds, and we called them pocket pets, and reptiles. I'm not fond of reptiles, but some people like to deal with them. And but I would love to see alums do more for their university than they're doing. If they all did, it wouldn't take a heck of a lot from each one. Maybe we ought to have an Obama campaign email, can you send us $10 to the foundation for the future of OSU? And please give us your credit card number. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll just put $10 on it. And he raised millions doing that. Mm-hmm. And there's got to be a way there somehow. Mm-hmm. And but there are not that many Boone Pickens out there.
Yeah.
I don't know another one. He was a student here. I think he graduated in '52, I believe, in geology. I'm not certain that that's true. But, and I wondered at the time, I told one of my classmates, we're in the life science building, we're in the engineering building, the geology department had a display there. There was some rocks under an ultraviolet light. They sparkled. I said, what in the world would anybody want with a geology degree? And that's where Boone Pickens got his degree. I didn't know a thing about oil and natural gas, obviously. But at any rate, there's not a lot of those, and he's certainly been a great, I mean, that's an enormous amount of money. Of course, if you have that kind of money, I don't know what Warren Buffett's done for Nebraska, but I suspect he might have given him some money.
Well, I think if we wrap this up right about now.
Okay,
if that's
fine
okay.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just rattling on.
No, that's
yep,
fine. No, that's important because that's why we wanted to ask. But I just want to thank you so much for your time
Well, you're welcome.
and for taking part in this. I know you're not here all that often, so I appreciate that
Happy
you were
do
able to
it.
give us some time while you were here.
Well, you're most welcome.